There is a kind of silence that only comes after war. Not the silence of peace. The silence of a man who has returned to a world that kept moving without him, and now stands at the edge of it wondering whether there is still a place with his name on it. Garrett Cole knew that silence, the way he knew the weight of his own boots. He had carried it through 3 tours, through the divorce proceedings that carved his life in half, through the last weeks at the VA facility outside Memphis, where a counselor with kind eyes told him he was ready to reintegrate, as if belonging to somewhere were a skill you could rehearse. He was 47 years old. He had a German Shepherd named Rex, and a duffel bag, and a pickup truck with a cracked windshield. And he had decided, after a long time of not deciding anything, to go back to Calloway. Calloway, Tennessee. Population just under 4,000. The kind of town where the diner has not changed its menu since 1987, and the same families have held the same county seats for generations. The kind of town where everybody knows your name, which sounds like a comfort until you realize that what they know about your name is something they would rather not be reminded of. Garrett had grown up there. His mother had raised him in a white clapboard house on the east side of town after his father died, and she had worked herself threadbare, keeping that house until she passed the winter. Garrett was on his 2nd tour. He had not been back since the funeral. 14 years. He told himself he was going back because it was home. And that was true in the way that partial truths are true. But the fuller truth was that he had nowhere else. The VA disability check covered survival, but not much more. And every city he had tried since the divorce had eventually made him feel like a stranger auditioning for a life that was already cast. So he pointed the truck toward Calloway with Rex riding shotgun, that big German Shepherd with the dark saddle markings and the amber eyes that missed nothing. And he drove through the October hills as the leaves went red and gold around him. He pulled into town on a Wednesday afternoon. The hardware store, the diner, the post office with the flag that always flew a little crooked. It was all exactly as he remembered, and it felt entirely foreign. The way a word sounds strange when you say it too many times. He drove past the lot where his mother's house had stood, and found it empty. Just a concrete slab going back to weeds. That was the first thing he needed a place to rent. He had enough saved for 3 months up front, which in Calloway should have been more than enough to secure a room or a small apartment. He was wrong about that. The first landlord, a man named Pruitt, who owned 4 rental houses on the south end of town, met him at the door of the first property, looked him over, said the unit had just been taken. It had not. Garrett could see through the window that the place was empty. Furniture gone, floors swept. The second landlord did not come to the door at all, though Garrett could hear the television inside. He knocked 3 times, left his number on a scrap of paper, and never received a call back. The third told him directly, almost pleasantly, that she preferred tenants with local references. When Garrett explained that he had been away for 14 years serving in the Army, she nodded as if this confirmed something she already suspected, and said she hoped he found something suitable. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that follows. Calloway had not forgotten Garrett Cole. It had remembered him in exactly the wrong way. His father, decades gone, had left behind a complicated reputation. A man who drank and borrowed and made promises he could not keep. The town had filed that reputation under the family name, and when Garrett appeared in that driveway after 14 years away, what they saw was not a veteran coming home. They saw a Cole, and the Coles, in Calloway's long memory, were people you did not extend credit or keys to. Garrett did not know this yet. He would piece it together slowly. That first week, he slept in the cab of his truck parked at the edge of the fairgrounds lot, with Rex curled across the back seat and the windows cracked against the autumn chill. He ate at the diner, twice a day, because it was the one place in town where money was enough of a credential. The woman behind the counter, Darlene, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a brisk manner, gave him the same level courtesy she gave everyone, which was more than he was getting anywhere else. He applied for work at the hardware store. The owner, a florid man named Dunbar, said he was not hiring. The sign in the window said otherwise. He tried the auto shop on Route 9. The mechanic there, a younger man named Terrell, seemed interested, leaning forward even, until he asked Garrett's last name, and then something shifted behind his eyes. He said he would call. He did not. By the end of the first week, Garrett had started to understand that this was not going to be the clean homecoming he had half imagined. There was no clean homecoming waiting for him in Calloway. The door had been shut, and from the inside, people were pretending they could not hear his knock. Rex took all of this with the steady patience of his breed. Each morning, Garrett would let him out of the truck, and they would walk the town's perimeter in the early light, the dog moving with that fluid, unhurried attention that German shepherds carry like a second nature, scanning the fence lines and the tree edges. People on the sidewalk would step aside for Rex, without quite meeting Garrett's eyes. The dog made them nervous. Garrett found he did not mind. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. On the 7th morning, on a walk that took them down a side street Garrett had not tried before, Rex stopped. He did not slow down, did not hesitate, did not sniff at something interesting on the ground. He simply stopped, all four paws planted, ears forward, and looked at a house set back from the road behind a line of old oak trees. It was a 2-story house, white paint gone gray, a porch that sagged at one corner, windows that still held their glass but were filmed with years of dust. The yard around it was not quite wild, but not quite kept either. The grass long, but not entirely gone to seed, as if someone occasionally ran a mower through it without much conviction. A mailbox at the end of the gravel drive had the name Alderman on it in peeling stick-on letters. Garrett looked at the house. Rex looked at the house. "Come on," Garrett said. Rex did not move. He said it again. He tugged the leash. The dog planted deeper, not straining against the leash, but not yielding to it either, just standing with that particular German shepherd certainty. "That means I have made a calculation, and the calculation says stay." Garrett let out a slow breath and stood there with his dog in the morning, quiet of that side street, and looked at the gray house behind the oaks. He could not have said what he felt. Not recognition exactly. Something older than recognition. The feeling of a word at the edge of your tongue that you cannot quite retrieve. He finally got Rex moving by walking alongside the fence line rather than away from the property. And the dog accepted this compromise, walking with him along the edge of the yard, head turned toward the house the entire time until they reached the corner and passed beyond the fence line. Then Rex walked normally again as if the subject were closed. But Garrett's mind was not closed on it. That afternoon he was sitting on a bench outside the post office eating a sandwich when the woman sat down beside him. She was old in the way that commands a room without trying, the kind that carries its years with complete unapology. She wore a blue cardigan despite the warmth, and had a canvas bag of groceries beside her feet. Her name, he would learn, was Eunice Hartley, and she had lived in Calloway for 71 of her 83 years. She looked at Rex, who was lying at Garrett's feet, with his chin on his paws. "That is a serious dog," she said. "Yes, ma'am. What's his name, Rex?" She nodded as if this made sense. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street. Then she said, without particular emphasis, "You're Margaret Cole's boy." Garrett looked at her. "I knew your mother. She was a good woman, better than this town gave her credit for." She said it simply as a statement of record rather than consolation. He asked her, on an impulse he did not fully understand, about the gray house on the side street, the one behind the oaks. Eunice Hartley did not answer immediately. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on a different quality, careful and weighted. "That house," she said, "has a long history in this town, longer than most people know or care to remember." She told him what she knew. She told him slowly, the way old people tell things that matter, with context and patience, not rushing toward the point, but approaching it the way you approach something fragile. The house had been built in 1931 by a man named Raymond Cole. Garrett went very still. Raymond Cole had been Garrett's grandfather. He had built that house with his own hands over 2 years, working weekends and evenings after his shifts at the mill, and he had raised his family in it, including Garrett's father, until 1962, when Raymond died of a heart attack at 58. After his death, the house and the property had passed to Garrett's grandmother, Vera Cole, who was, by then, in poor health, and not equipped to manage what happened next. "What happened next?" Eunice said, still looking at the street rather than at Garrett. "Was that a man named Howard Alderman had come to Vera with papers. He had told her the papers were a refinancing agreement, a way to reduce the burden of the property taxes that had been accumulating. Vera Cole could not read well. She had trusted Howard Alderman because he wore a good suit and spoke in the measured tones of a man who handled these things professionally. She signed the papers. The papers were not a refinancing agreement. They were a deed transfer. By the time anyone understood what had happened, Howard Alderman owned the house, and Vera Cole was a tenant in the place her husband had built, paying rent until the new owner found a reason to ask her to leave, which did not take long. Eunice Hartley folded her hands in her lap. "Nobody did anything about it," she said. "The Aldermans had money and connections, and the Coles were already not popular in town, and Vera was too sick and too tired to fight. She moved in with her sister in Knoxville and died there 2 years later." She paused. "The house has been Alderman property ever since Garrett sat with this for a long time." Rex had lifted his head and was watching him with those amber eyes. What nobody knew at the time was that the dog had already known. Garrett did not tell Eunice that Rex had stopped in front of that house without any prompting. He was not sure she would have found it strange. He was not sure he found it strange anymore either. He drove past the house again that evening. Slowly. Rex stood up in the passenger seat and pressed his nose against the glass and made a low sound in his throat that was not quite a whimper and not quite a growl. Just acknowledgement. Like a man recognizing a place he has only heard described. The house was occupied. Garrett could see lights in the downstairs windows and a newer model sedan in the gravel drive. He had since learned that a man named Dale Alderman, Howard's grandson, lived there now. Dale was in his late 30s and worked in insurance and had no particular claim to the house beyond the claim that generations of possession create, which is the kind of claim that tends to harden into permanence when no one challenges it. Garrett was going to challenge it. He did not know yet how. He did not know if it was even possible after 6 decades. He understood that he had no documentation, no lawyer, no money beyond what he needed to survive, and no goodwill in this town to draw on. He also understood that he was sleeping in a truck and had been turned away from every door he had knocked on, and that the house his grandfather built was lit up on the other side of town with someone else's lights. If that sounds like a man with nothing to lose, that is because he was. The county clerk's office occupied the ground floor of a building that also housed the assessor and the Department of Motor Vehicles. It smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner, the specific smell of municipal record-keeping that has not changed since records began being kept. Garrett went there on a Monday morning with no particular plan beyond seeing what existed. The clerk behind the counter was a young woman, mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her head. Her name tag said May. She looked up when he came in and gave him the professional courtesy of someone whose job is to help people navigate bureaucratic systems, regardless of their circumstances. He told her he was researching a property. He gave her the address. She pulled records. She did this without fuss, moving through the filing system with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. And she set a folder on the counter between them. The record showed the 1962 deed transfer from Vera Cole to Howard Alderman, exactly as Eunice had described. The transfer price listed was $1, which in a legal deed transaction indicates a gift or nominal consideration rather than a market sale. A legitimate gift, if that is what it were, would have required Vera Cole's clear and informed consent. Garrett stood at the counter, looking at the document for a long time. May, who had been working at her desk while he reviewed the file, came back to the counter. She looked at the document, then at him. "You have a personal connection to this property?" she asked. He told her. Not everything, but enough. His grandfather's name, the house, what Eunice Hartley had told him, the $1 transfer price on a house Howard Alderman had described to a widow as a refinancing arrangement. May did not make a face of dramatic sympathy. She listened with a focused attention that Garrett found, after a week of people not quite meeting his eyes, something close to remarkable. The transfer being for $1 doesn't by itself prove fraud, she said. But it is unusual for a legitimate sale. If your grandmother was deceived about what she was signing, that would be a different question. She paused. Are there other records? From before the transfer, there the conversation began. Garrett came back the next day, and the day after that. May, whose full name was May Sutton, had taken it upon herself to pull the full chain of title for the property, which meant going back not just to 1962, but to the original plat records from 1931. This was not technically her job, but she seemed to make decisions about what her job included based on criteria that went beyond the job description. She also, on the third morning, brought him a cup of coffee without asking. He noticed this. He noticed the way she explained things without condescension. The way she would pull a record and set it on the counter and say, "Here, look at this," rather than summarizing it for him as if he could not read a document himself. He was a man who had spent decades being processed by systems, medical systems, military systems, legal systems. And the universal quality of those systems was that they moved you through rather than stopping to see you clearly. May Sutton stopped. Rex waited outside the clerk's office, tied to the bike rack. And when Garrett came out each afternoon, Rex would stand and assess him with the particular seriousness of a dog who has decided that a person's emotional state is relevant information. On the second afternoon, May came out at closing time and stopped when she saw the dog. She looked at Rex. Rex looked at her with those amber eyes, ears slightly forward, reading her the way dogs read people, with complete attention and without judgment. "He's beautiful," she said. "He's opinionated," Garrett said. She almost smiled at that. "What does he think of me?" Rex's tail moved once, a single, slow sweep. "High marks," Garrett said. That was only round one of what would become something neither of them named for a long time, but which was present from the beginning, in the way that certain things are present from the beginning. Existing in the space, what Garrett did not know yet was that May Sutton had her own history with the Alderman family. Not dramatic history, the quiet kind. Her mother had worked as a housekeeper for Dale Alderman's parents for 11 years and had been let go without severance when the old couple moved to Florida, with a handshake and a verbal promise of a reference that was never put in writing and never particularly forthcoming when prospective employers called. May had watched her mother absorb that injustice with the dignified exhaustion of someone who understands that there are people in a town who can be held to account and people who cannot, and who has learned which category she belongs to. Quote, "She had filed this away. She had done her job and been professional and not said anything about it to anyone. But she recognized the shape of a Calloway injustice. And when Garrett Cole walked into the clerk's office asking about a 1962 deed transfer for $1, she recognized the shape of this one too. By the end of the second week, she had pulled everything available in the county records. The picture that emerged was incomplete but suggestive. Raymond Cole had paid property taxes on the house continuously from 1931 until his death in 1962. Vera Cole had paid property taxes from 1962 until the transfer. The transfer document itself was a standard form, but the signature line showed Vera's name in handwriting that a later document comparison would describe as consistent with someone signing under duress or confusion. The letters unsteady, the name trailing off at the end. But this was only part of the picture. And here is where the story takes a different kind of turn. May had been searching the archived records systematically, working backward through the years, and on a Thursday afternoon she found a reference in a 1961 property survey to a document described as the original registered deed. The supplementary archive was in the basement. She went down herself that evening after the office closed, with a flashlight and the reference number, and found the filing box exactly where the 1961 survey said it would be. On a shelf behind a filing cabinet that had been moved at some point and never moved back, effectively hiding the box from casual notice. Inside the box was the original deed for the Cole property, registered in 1931 in Raymond Cole's name, with his full legal description of the property boundaries, his notarized signature, and the county registrar's official stamp. She set the document on the counter in front of Garrett the next morning. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Rags, tied to the bike rack outside, made no sound. But if you had been watching the dog, you would have seen that he was facing the building, ears up, as if listening to something through the walls. Now, Garrett could have stopped there. He didn't. Not even close. The document was genuine. The county registrar's stamp was verifiable. The date was consistent with Raymond Cole's tax records beginning the same year. It was, in the dry language of property law, the superior instrument predating everything that had followed. But, superior instrument or not, a 1931 deed sitting in a basement filing box did not automatically undo 6 decades of alderman ownership. Garrett understood this. What they had was evidence of prior ownership and a suspicious transfer, not a legal ruling in his favor. For that, he would need a court. And before he could get to a court, something else would have to happen. Dale Alderman found out that someone was searching the title history of his property. In a town of 4,000 people, information moves at the speed of conversation. Someone at the clerk's office, not May, mentioned to someone else that a man named Cole had been coming in every day, asking about the Alderman place on Oak Street. That someone else mentioned it to Dale Alderman, at the diner over coffee. Dale Alderman was not a dramatic man. He was careful and methodical in the way that people who have inherited things tend to be, protective of what they hold without necessarily having worked for it. He did not call Garrett. He called his attorney. Within 48 hours, Garrett received a notice from the Calloway County Sheriff's Office. It was not an arrest notice. It was a civil notice informing him that Dale Alderman had filed a complaint regarding a man of no fixed address who had been observed lingering near his property on multiple occasions, and that the county was prepared to pursue a trespass order if the behavior continued. No fixed address. Garrett read the notice in his truck cab with Rex beside him and the Tennessee hills going dark gold outside the windows. In the late afternoon light, he had not set foot on that property. He had driven past it twice. He had done nothing that any resident of Calloway could not have done on a public road. But the notice was real, and the implication was clear. Ibersis, the Alderman family, with a word to the right people, could generate official pressure on a man sleeping in his truck with no local standing and no local allies. The message was not subtle. Go away, and this goes away with you. He sat with the notice for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in the glove compartment and went to sleep. In the morning, he went back to the county clerk's office. May saw his face when he came in and said nothing, just poured him coffee and set the folder on the counter. He told her about the notice. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "There's a legal aid clinic in Maryville. The attorney there, a woman named Iris Webb, has handled 3 property fraud cases in the last decade, 2 of them in counties that had given up on pursuing them." She said it in the same tone she used for everything, level and without performance. But Garrett had spent enough time in that office by then to read the difference between May doing her job and May doing something else. This was the second thing. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Because the record is the record," she said. "What's in those files is what happened. Someone should care about that." It was a practical answer. It was also the truest thing anyone had said to him since he arrived in Calloway. He drove to Maryville that afternoon with Rex. Iris Webb's office was on the 2nd floor of a building above a pharmacy, and the waiting room had the particular organized chaos of a small legal practice doing more work than it had resources for. Stacks of folders on every surface, a printer running in the back room, 2 other people waiting ahead of him on plastic chairs. Iris Webb was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and the focused economy of movement that comes from decades of doing too much with too little. She looked at the documents Garrett had brought. The original 1931 deed, the 1962 transfer record, the tax history, and the property survey referencing the supplementary archive. She read slowly and thoroughly without speaking. When she finished, she looked up. "This is interesting," she said, which, from the way she said it, meant something closer to, "This matters." She explained the legal landscape clearly, without softening it. Adverse possession law in Tennessee meant that 60 years of continuous occupancy by the Aldermans would be a significant obstacle. The fraud claim against Howard Alderman, who was long dead, would need to be established through documentary evidence rather than testimony, since everyone who had witnessed the original transaction was gone. And the court would need to weigh the equities of disrupting a current owner's long-standing possession against the claim of fraud in the original transfer. None of this was impossible, she said. None of it was simple either. The trespass notice was, in her view, a tactical move designed to provoke Garrett into either confrontation that could be used against him or retreat She recommended ignoring it beyond the strictly legal. He had done nothing that warranted it. And here was the thing about timing, she said. If he were going to file, he needed to do it before the alderman attorney filed anything preemptive in civil court, which, based on the activity she was hearing about in the county system, could happen within 2 weeks. This was the clock. And Garrett could now hear it clearly. He drove back to Calloway in the dark with Rex asleep across the back seat and thought about what he had. A document. An old woman's memory. A young clerk who believed that records mattered. And a German shepherd who had stopped in front of a house on a side street on the 7th day and refused to move. He was a man who had operated in places where the situation on paper and the situation on the ground were two different things, and you had to be honest about both. On paper, he had a plausible fraud claim. On the ground, he had no money for a retainer, no standing in the community that would give the claim social weight, and an opposing family with 60 years of local credibility and an attorney already in motion. There was a gap between those two realities. He needed something to close it. He did not sleep much that night. Rex slept deeply, taking up the entire back seat with the unconscious confidence of a large dog who has decided that his person will handle whatever needs handling and that worrying is not his department. In the morning, Garrett let Rex out for his run around the fairgrounds lot, and he watched the dog move through the early light with that loose, efficient gait, nose working, ears swiveling, processing the world with complete attention. A thought arrived, quiet and specific, the way the important ones sometimes do. Rex had found the house. He did not mean this mystically. He meant it practically, in the way that a man who has worked alongside working dogs understands how they operate. Rex was not psychic. But Rex had ridden with Garrett through 14 years of his mother's stories, had been with him through the years of his service, had slept beside him through the worst nights. The dog carried a kind of accumulated knowledge that was not knowledge in the rational sense, but was not nothing either. And Rex had stopped in front of that house. On an impulse, he drove back to Oak Street. He parked at the edge of the street, not on the property, not approaching the house, just at the curb. Rex was in the passenger seat, and as soon as the truck stopped, the dog was up and alert, facing the house through the windshield. The yard. Garrett looked at the yard. He had been thinking about documents and legal arguments and procedural timelines, the vocabulary of courts and records. He had not been thinking about the yard. Raymond Cole had built that house in 1931 and lived in it until 1962. 31 years. People who live somewhere for 31 years do things to a yard. They plant things. They build things. An old man with a house he intended to keep forever might also, in uncertain times, preserve certain things. Depression-era men who had watched banks fail and institutions dissolve did not always trust paper records to remain where paper records were filed. They made their own backups in the only archive they trusted completely. It was not a certain theory, but it was a theory. He went back to May. He told her the theory. She listened, and in her focused, practical way, she said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You'd need to get onto the property. I know. Without that being used as trespass." "I know," she thought about it. "Dale Alderman is away this weekend. He goes to his sister's in Nashville the second weekend of every month. He's been doing it for years." She said this in the tone of someone reporting a fact contained in a county record, which in a small town is more or less the same thing. If you had a reason to be on that property, a legitimate reason that he had agreed to in writing, he's not going to agree to anything. "No," she said. but his property management company might. They handled the yard maintenance. A call requesting an inspection for a fence line survey discrepancy from a neighboring lot with a county filing reference would likely produce a temporary access agreement, which is a form filed with the assessor's office and takes 48 hours to process. Garrett looked at her for a moment. "Is there a fence line survey discrepancy?" he asked. "There's a discrepancy in the 1961 plat survey I found earlier this week," she said. "I was going to correct it administratively. I haven't filed the correction yet." She said this without expression. He understood what she was not saying, which was, "There is a window here, and it is narrow, and I am holding it open." 2 days later, on a Saturday morning when Dale Alderman's car was not in the gravel drive, Garrett and Rex walked through the gate of the Oak Street property with a temporary access form in his pocket and a look on his face that he had spent 20 years in the Army perfecting. Rex moved differently on the property, not nervously, more purposefully, the way a dog moves when a scent resolves from general to specific. He walked the fence line once, ears forward, and then he turned and walked directly to the far corner of the yard, where a large oak tree had grown close enough to the back fence that its roots had lifted the ground around it into a series of shallow ridges. He stopped at one specific spot, 3 feet from the base of the tree, and sat down. Garrett looked at the spot. The ground there was slightly different from the surrounding yard. Not dramatically, not in a way you would notice without looking for it, but the grass was a shade thinner, the soil a shade darker, as if something below had changed the composition of what grew above it. He had brought a trowel. He did not know exactly why. He told himself it was for the fence line inspection. He dug. He found it at about 14 inches down, at the boundary where the topsoil met the clay layer below it. A tin box, the kind that had once held tobacco, sealed with wax around the lid seam in the manner of someone who intended it to last. The wax had held. The tin had not rusted through. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff with age, but had preserved what it contained, was a folded document. He did not open it on the spot. He put it in his jacket and finished the fence line inspection and signed the access form completion and walked back to his truck with Rex at his side, and he drove directly to Iris Webb in Maryville. The document was a copy of the original deed, Raymond Cole's handwriting, signed and dated 1931, with a notation in the margin in the same hand. "For my children and their children. This land belongs to the Coles." It was not a legal instrument on its own, but it was Raymond Cole's personal archive, his own ownership, preserved below his own yard, in a location that only someone who knew the property would have thought to dig. And when paired with the county registered deed that May had found in the basement, and the anomalous transfer record, and Vera Cole's tax payments up to the month of transfer, it completed a picture that Iris Webb described, with her characteristic understatement, as compelling. "This is going to court," she said. She filed the fraud claim the following Monday, 46 hours before the alderman attorney filed his preemptive civil action for trespass and harassment. The sequence mattered. Garrett's filing went in first. The framework of the case was established on his terms. Calloway did not take it quietly. The alderman family's attorney argued immediately for dismissal on the grounds of adverse possession, the 60-year occupation, and the question of what a copy of a deed found in someone's yard could legally establish. Dale Alderman gave a statement to the local paper in which he described himself as a victim of harassment by a transient with no connection to the community. That word, transient, it appeared in the paper on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Eunice Hartley had called the editor and given a statement of her own, precise and unadorned, recounting what she knew of Vera Cole's circumstances in 1962, including the name of the attorney she had watched Howard Alderman consult twice in the month before the transfer. That attorney had been disbarred in 1971 for document fraud. In an unrelated case, a fact that May found in the state bar records and passed to Iris Webb without fanfare. The disbarment record did not prove anything directly, but it placed Howard Alderman's legal counsel in a specific context, the context of a man who specialized in making transactions appear legitimate that were not. The county court set a hearing date 6 weeks out. In those 6 weeks, Garrett Cole continued to sleep in his truck. He continued to eat breakfast at Darlene's Diner. He continued to walk Rex through the town each morning, and people continued to step aside on the sidewalk, though he began to notice that one or two of them met his eyes now. Not many. But the town's certainty about him had developed a small crack. And cracks in small towns grow in interesting ways. Once they start, May brought him dinner twice, unremarked upon. The second time she brought 2 portions and they ate in the parking lot behind the clerk's office with Rex lying between them in the autumn dark. And they talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with deed records or court dates. About what it felt like to come back to a place and find it had already decided who you were. About the particular loneliness of being competent in systems that still manage to make you feel invisible. About what a person owes a place and what a place owes a person. Rex put his head on May's knee at some point during this conversation, and she rested her hand on his neck without breaking her sentence, and Garrett noted this with the specific attention of a man who has learned to read the things that matter in the spaces between words. If you're finding this story worth your time, hit subscribe. Stories like Garrett's are what this channel exists for, and there are more of them waiting. The Alderman attorney filed 2 motions in the weeks before the hearing, both aimed at narrowing the evidentiary scope, both denied by the judge, a woman named Carver, who had the patient demeanor of someone who had seen a great many attempts to narrow evidentiary scope. The document examiner Iris Webb engaged, a retired forensic specialist from Nashville, filed her report 2 weeks before the hearing date. Her analysis of Vera Cole's signature on the 1962 transfer document, compared against Vera's signature on her tax payment records from the same year, showed markers consistent with someone in a state of significant stress or confusion at the time of signing. The letter formations in her name on the transfer document showed a specific tremor pattern not present in her tax records from 3 months prior. The pattern, the examiner noted, was consistent with someone who did not fully understand what she was signing. This was not proof of fraud in the conclusive sense, but it was evidence. And evidence, in Judge Carver's courtroom, was taken seriously. The hearing lasted 2 days. The Alderman attorney was skilled and argued the adverse possession doctrine with confidence, because it was his strongest ground and he knew it. 60 years was 60 years. The law recognized continuous occupation. The original fraud, even if established, had to be weighed against the equities of displacing a current owner who had done nothing himself. Iris Webb argued the other side of those equities. The fraud had been committed against a widow who could not read well, by a man who had used a disbarred attorney known for document manipulation, for the price of $1. The 60 years of occupation that the aldermans claimed as their shield had been built on that foundation. A court that allowed adverse possession to launder a documented fraud would be saying, in effect, that the length of time a theft goes uncontested eventually makes it legitimate. Judge Carver heard both sides without expression. She did not rule from the bench. She took it under advisement and set the ruling date for 3 weeks out, which in a case of this complexity was not unusual, but which felt, to a man sleeping in a truck in November in eastern Tennessee, like a very long 3 weeks. Rex did not seem to find it long. The dog had settled into the rhythms of Calloway with the adaptability of his kind, knowing every dog and most of the regulars at the diner by name in the way dogs know names, through scent and pattern. Darlene had started putting a bowl of water outside the front door on mornings when she saw the truck in the lot. The hardware store owner, Dunbar, who had told Garrett he was not hiring, had twice stopped to scratch Rex behind the ears on the sidewalk and had not quite met Garrett's eyes during these interactions, which Garrett read as a kind of inarticulate adjustment in progress. The town was watching, not warmly, not yet, but with the specific attention of a community that has been given reason to reconsider something it was previously certain about. On the morning of the ruling, Garrett put on the cleanest clothes he had, which were clean because May had run them through the laundry at her place the previous evening, without being asked and without making an occasion of it. Rex rode to the courthouse with him. He could not bring the dog inside, so he left Rex in the truck with the windows cracked and walked up the courthouse steps alone. The courtroom smelled of old wood and institutional heat. Eunice Hartley was in the third row. May was beside her. Iris Webb was at the plaintiff's table with 2 folders and a yellow legal pad. Judge Carver came in and sat and adjusted her glasses and looked at the room and began to speak. She reviewed the evidence systematically, as she always did, without editorializing, presenting the facts of each finding before drawing her conclusion. The original 1931 deed, registered and verifiable. The supplementary archive record, located by the county clerk. The 1962 transfer for $1 with the anomalous signature. The disbarment history of Howard Alderman's attorney. The preserved tin document. The forensic analysis of Vera Cole's signature. She paused, and then she said that the adverse possession doctrine, while a legitimate and important principle of property law, was not designed to protect transactions fraudulently obtained. That the evidence presented established to the preponderance standard required in civil proceedings. That the 1962 transfer had been accomplished through material misrepresentation to a vulnerable widow who did not understand the nature of what she was signing. That the equities did not favor protecting 60 years of possession, built on that foundation, when the original wrong was documentable. She found for the plaintiff. The house on Oak Street, and the lot on which it stood, was the lawful property of Garrett Cole. The room was very quiet for a moment, then it was not quiet. The alderman attorney was already on his feet. He would appeal, he said. The ruling was wrong on the adverse possession doctrine, and he intended to take it up. Judge Carver noted his intention for the record and informed him he had 30 days. Garrett heard all of this from a place that felt slightly removed from the courtroom, the way significant moments sometimes arrange themselves at a slight distance so you can see them properly. He heard Iris Webb's hand on his arm, and her voice saying it was a good ruling. He heard Eunice Hartley, in the third row, saying something to May, in a low voice. He looked at the table and the water glass and the grain of the old wood, and he thought about his grandfather building something with his hands, intending it to last, and burying a piece of paper that said so, and the dog finding it 60 years later. Outside, Rex was standing in the truck with both front paws on the dashboard and his nose against the windshield. When Garrett pushed through the courthouse doors, the dog's tail moved in a single slow arc, and then it moved faster, and then he was 110 pounds of German Shepherd trying to get out through a cracked window. And Garrett opened the door, and Rex landed on him with both paws and pushed his nose against his face with that blunt. Total affection that dogs dispense without calculation. There is a certain kind of grace that does not announce itself. Garrett Cole moved into the house on Oak Street 3 weeks later, while the appeal was pending, under a court order allowing occupancy. He cleaned it himself, room by room, over 2 weekends. May helped him paint the porch on the second Saturday. Rex patrolled the yard with the grave satisfaction of an animal who has always understood something that the humans around him took longer to see. The appeal failed. The alderman's attorney took it as far as the state appeals court, which reviewed the record and affirmed Judge Carver's ruling without modification. The fraud finding stood. The deed stood. The house, for the first time in 61 years, had a Cole in it again. The town of Calloway adjusted. Not all at once, and not without discomfort. There were people who were angry, people who felt the ruling reflected poorly on the community, people who preferred the version of events in which Garrett Cole was a transient with a grudge rather than a grandson recovering what had been stolen. Those people existed, and some of them still crossed the street when they saw him coming. But Dunbar at the hardware store offered him part-time work in November, which Garrett accepted. Darlene started calling him by his first name. 3 families on the east side of town, quietly, through intermediaries, let it be known that they had known his mother and thought well of her. Small things. The kind of small things that add up in a town of 4,000 into something that begins to resemble, if not welcome, at least a kind of grudging acknowledgement that a person has the right to exist among them. Garrett had the opportunity, when the local paper asked for a comment after the appeal failed, to say things about the Alderman family and about the town's role in 6 decades of complicity. He had thought about what he would say in those moments during the long weeks of waiting. And what he had arrived at was this. He thanked the county clerk's office. He thanked Iris Webb. He said that his grandfather had built something meant to last, and it had. He said nothing about the people who had turned him away. Grace, the old kind, does not require an audience. The house needed work. The porch corner that sagged had been sagging for years and needed new supports. The downstairs bathroom had a slow leak that had damaged the subfloor. The back fence was past repairing and needed to come down entirely. Garrett worked on it the way you work on something you intend to keep, steadily and without hurry, learning the house's particular complaints and tolerances the way you learn a person's. Rex approved of the house. He established his position on the porch within the first evening and held it with the authority of an animal who considers a good vantage point a matter of professional responsibility. He watched the street from there with his large ears swiveling at passing sounds and his amber eyes cataloging the world with the patient attention that German shepherds bring to everything they decide matters. On a Friday evening in December, May came for dinner. She had been coming most Fridays by then, sometimes bringing things, sometimes not, always with the ease of someone moving through a space they have been welcomed into. They ate at the kitchen table that Garrett had found in the back bedroom folded against the wall, a table old enough that he suspected it had been there since his grandfather's time, though he could not be certain. He had unfolded it and cleaned it and set it in the kitchen without ceremony. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the cold with their coats on and Rex between them, and Garrett looked out at Oak Street in the dark, the bare oaks at the edge of the yard, the porch light catching the gravel of the drive, the stars above the Tennessee hills going cold and bright. He had been turned away from every door. The town had decided he did not belong. The system that was supposed to protect people like his grandmother had instead been used against her, and the theft had lasted 6 decades because the people with power in Calloway had found it more convenient to let a wrong stand. He had come back to a place that did not want him, with a dog and a duffel bag and nothing else. And the dog had walked him to the house that had always been his. On the 7th day, and sat down in a yard that held the evidence that would give it back to him. He did not have a word for what that was. He was not a man who reached for words like destiny or providence. He was a man who had learned to trust what was in front of him. And what had been in front of him was a German shepherd, with amber eyes, sitting next to an oak tree with complete certainty. May said, looking at the same street, "What are you going to do with the downstairs room? The one facing the yard?" "Studio," Garrett said, though the word surprised him slightly as he said it. He had been thinking lately about the woodworking his grandfather had done, the tools he had read about in a letter his mother had saved, the things Raymond Cole had built with his hands. He had no training in it. He thought he might learn. May nodded as if this made complete sense. Rex's ears moved at something in the dark at the edge of the yard. He watched for a moment, then settled again, satisfied that whatever it was posed no threat worth addressing. The porch light held them in its small, warm circle, and beyond it, the oak tree stood in the dark, the way they had stood for a long time, rooted in ground that had finally come back to the name it was always supposed to carry. Garrett Cole was home, not because the town had welcomed him, not because the system had worked the way it should have, but because a dog knew where home was before a man did and had the patience to wait for him to understand it. Some things belong to you so completely that not even 60 years of someone else's name on the deed can change the fact of it. That house had been waiting. The tin in the ground had been waiting. The record in the basement of the county clerk's office had been waiting. And Rex, who had stopped on a side street on the 7th morning with all 4 paws planted, and his ears forward and his amber eyes fixed on a gray house behind oak trees, had been the only one in Calloway who already knew the waiting was over. If you made it to the end of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Hit subscribe and stay with us. There are more of them waiting.